Hi, I'm Megan.
And I'm Ray.
Welcome to the Massive Wealth Podcast. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into a company that's making some seriously bold moves in the world of Bitcoin MicroStrategy. You probably know them as a software company. But their recent Bitcoin buying spree has really shaken things up.
Yeah, they've pretty much gone all in on Bitcoin, spent billions to build up this massive pile of it. It's a fascinating strategy, and it brings up some really interesting questions about what's going to happen to MicroStrategy and to Bitcoin itself.
I've seen headlines about their stock performance, a 2,590% surge over the past 5 years. Could this stock actually turn like a $40,000 investment into over $1 million, or is that just way too risky?
Well, let's break it down and see what we can find out.
First things first, it's important to realize that MicroStrategy's growth isn't really coming from a software business anymore. Their Bitcoin holdings are what's driving their valuation. They spent $11.9 billion on Bitcoin, and right now that's worth a crazy $28.3 billion. That's more than double their initial investment. That's amazing. Over 30% of the company's whole market cap is tied up in Bitcoin. But it sounds like they're not even close to being done. What's this I hear about a 21-21 plan?
Yeah. Their 21-21 plan is a pretty ambitious one. They're trying to raise a huge $42 billion, half through equity and half through fixed income securities. And all of it is to buy even more Bitcoin. They're basically doubling down on their bet.
That's a lot of faith in Bitcoin. But I'm curious, how is all this impacting their actual business? Is their software side still bringing in revenue?
Well, their software revenue actually went down in 2023. And to pay for all this Bitcoin, they've had to take on a lot of debt and issue more shares, which can dilute the value of the existing shares.
So there are definitely some financial risks here. But what about these impairment charges I keep hearing about? What exactly does that mean for a company like MicroStrategy?
Impairment charges happen when the value of an asset like Bitcoin drops below what the company has it recorded as on their balance sheet. So if Bitcoin's price takes a hit, MicroStrategy has to account for that loss, and it can definitely impact their profitability.
Okay, so there's definitely a downside here. But let's flip the script. What if Bitcoin really does go through the roof like some people are predicting?
That's where things get really interesting. Michael Saylor, MicroStrategy's co-founder and a huge Bitcoin advocate, has said Bitcoin could hit $13 million per coin in the next 2 decades. And VanEck, an investment management firm, has an even crazier estimate, $52 million per Bitcoin by 2050. Now it's important to remember that VanEck offers a Bitcoin ETF, so they definitely have a reason to want to see Bitcoin succeed.
Those are some pretty wild numbers. If those predictions are even close to accurate, MicroStrategy could see some insane gains, right?
Oh, absolutely. But the question is, how realistic are those predictions? What's the thinking behind them? Let's dig into that a little bit. One of the main arguments for these huge price increases has to do with something called Bitcoin halving.
Halving? I'm not familiar with that. What does that even mean in the world of Bitcoin?
Basically, every 4 years, the rate at which new Bitcoin is created gets cut in half. This means the supply of new Bitcoin entering the market slows down a lot.
So if less Bitcoin is being created, basic economics tells us that if the demand stays the same or goes up, the price should go up too.
Right, exactly. And that's a core part of the argument for why people think Bitcoin's price will keep going up. Less supply plus more demand equals higher prices. Of course, it's not quite that simple. There are a lot of other things going on, and nobody can predict the future for sure. But those halving events are definitely worth keeping in mind.
Okay, so halvings are important, but I still can't get over this feeling that Bitcoin is just so volatile. What happens to MicroStrategy if the price of Bitcoin suddenly drops?
That's a valid concern for sure, and it's a big one. There's no denying that MicroStrategy's stock price is really closely tied to the price of Bitcoin.
So if Bitcoin takes a hit, MicroStrategy takes a hit. Is it really that simple?
Pretty much. But here's where it gets interesting. Some analysts think that MicroStrategy's strategy of buying so much Bitcoin while risky could actually lead to their stock doing better than Bitcoin over the long term.
Wait, really? Mm-hmm. I don't really get that. How could they do better than Bitcoin if their stock is so connected to its price?
Think about it this way. As MicroStrategy keeps buying tons of Bitcoin, their holdings are getting more and more concentrated. Every share of MicroStrategy stock represents a bigger and bigger piece of the Bitcoin pie.
So as Bitcoin goes up, the value of their holdings goes up even faster than if you just own Bitcoin yourself.
Exactly. It's like a leveraged play. They're basically amplifying their exposure to Bitcoin's price movements, which means bigger gains if Bitcoin goes up, but also
bigger losses if it goes down. Yeah, I'm starting to see both the good and the bad here. This is definitely not a hands-off investment strategy.
You got it. High risk, high reward. And
Yeah.
it takes a real understanding of both Bitcoin and how MicroStrategy is approaching this whole thing.
So for someone who's actually thinking about investing in MicroStrategy, what are the most important things to consider?
First and foremost, they have to be comfortable with a lot of risk. This isn't like investing in some big, stable company. It's basically betting on the future of Bitcoin. And as we've been talking about, Bitcoin can be incredibly unpredictable.
It's not for the risk averse, that's for sure. What else?
Well, it's really important to understand that MicroStrategy's success isn't just about the price of Bitcoin. It's also about how well they can manage their Bitcoin holdings. They need to make smart purchases, deal with all the complex regulations, and be ready to adapt as the crypto market changes.
Speaking of regulations, I know that governments all over the world are still trying to figure out what to do with Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. How does all that uncertainty affect a company like MicroStrategy?
That's a great question. The regulatory environment is definitely something to think about. Right now, the U.S. government is generally seen as pretty friendly towards crypto, but that could change, and any new regulations or restrictions could really impact how MicroStrategy operates.
So there's a bit of political risk involved, too.
Absolutely. And then there's the whole debate about how to classify Bitcoin. Is it a commodity? A security? The answer to that question could make a big difference in how it's regulated and taxed.
So MicroStrategy is working in a pretty unpredictable environment.
Yeah.
A lot of things could change, and they might not all be good changes.
You're right. It's a constantly evolving situation. That's why it's so crucial for anyone thinking about investing in MicroStrategy to do their homework, stay updated, and really understand the risks involved.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential rewards, the real risks, and all the uncertainty around regulations. Is there anything else we should know about MicroStrategy? Anything else that makes them stand out as an investment?
Well, there was a recent development that's worth mentioning. MicroStrategy was just added to the NASDAQ 100 index.
Wow, that's a big deal.
Oh.
So now they're listed right alongside some of the biggest tech companies in the world. How will that affect them?
Being included in a major index like the NASDAQ 100 can definitely make a company more visible and attract new investors. It also means that index funds that track the NASDAQ 100 will automatically buy shares of MicroStrategy, so that could lead to more demand for their stock.
Interesting. So even beyond their Bitcoin strategy, there are other things going on that could impact how their stock performs.
Exactly. You have to look at the whole picture and not just get hung up on one thing.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, but I'm wondering, what are your personal thoughts on MicroStrategy? Would you invest in them?
Well, I can't give you any financial advice, but I will say that MicroStrategy is a company I'm keeping a close eye on. They're pushing the limits and doing things their own way. Their big bet on Bitcoin could be revolutionary, or it could be a huge failure. Either way, it's going to be an interesting ride.
It definitely is. And I think that's a great place to wrap up this part of our deep dive. When we come back, we'll dig into some of the more technical details of MicroStrategy's Bitcoin strategy, including this idea of Bitcoin yield. Welcome back to the Massive Wealth Podcast. We're in the home stretch now of our deep dive into MicroStrategy. And before the break, you mentioned something called Bitcoin yield. Got to know more about that.
What exactly is Bitcoin yield, and what does it have to do with MicroStrategy?
It's something people don't always pay attention to, but it's really important for understanding how well their strategy is working. Bitcoin yield basically measures how much a company's Bitcoin holdings are growing per share.
Yeah.
So it's not just about how much Bitcoin they have in total, but how much of that Bitcoin is actually reflected in the value for each individual shareholder.
So if a company has a higher Bitcoin yield, that means each share of their stock is backed by more and more Bitcoin.
Exactly. And MicroStrategy has actually been doing better than expected when it comes to Bitcoin yield. In the first half of 2024, they had a 12.1% yield. Wow, that's pretty impressive, especially since their goal was somewhere between 6 and 10%. Does that mean their strategy is actually working?
It's definitely a good sign. It shows they're not just buying up a bunch of Bitcoin, but they're doing it in a way that's actually creating value for their shareholders. It tells us their acquisition strategy is probably pretty smart and they're executing it well.
So they're not just betting on Bitcoin itself, they're also betting on their ability to handle all that Bitcoin the right way. That adds a whole other layer of complexity, doesn't it?
For sure. And we can't forget about all the regulations and stuff. The rules are changing all the time when it comes to crypto, and that creates both good and bad things for MicroStrategy.
Okay, so let's talk about that.
Yeah.
What are some of the regulatory things they're facing, and how could those affect them in the future?
Well, like we talked about earlier, the U.S. government seems to be pretty positive about crypto right now, but that could change if different people get in charge or if the government's priorities change. And when you look at the whole world, it's even more complicated with different rules everywhere.
So they're kind of working in a bit of a gray area. What specific regulations are they worried about that could really shake things up for them?
There are a lot of things happening. Some lawmakers want stricter rules about knowing who your customers are and preventing money laundering for crypto companies. Others are trying to figure out taxes, like how to classify Bitcoin transactions and how to tax them. And then there's the whole debate about whether Bitcoin is a security, a commodity, or something else entirely.
It sounds like a lot could change, and it might not all be good for MicroStrategy.
Right, and that's why it's so important for anyone who's thinking about investing in MicroStrategy to keep up with all the regulatory stuff and understand what the risks could be.
So we've talked about the potential, the risks, the regulatory stuff. What's next for MicroStrategy? What should we be watching out for in the next few months or years?
There are a couple of things to keep an eye on. Some analysts think that if MicroStrategy keeps doing what they're doing, they could be added to the S&P 500 index by 2025.
Wow, that would be massive. The S&P 500 is like the most important stock index in the world. Being included in that would be a huge win for their strategy.
It would definitely be a big signal to the market, and it could bring in even more investors, which would push their stock price even higher. But of course, it all depends on what Bitcoin does. That's the big unknown.
True. It all comes back to Bitcoin. If Bitcoin keeps going up, MicroStrategy could be in a really good spot. But if it crashes, well, that could be really bad.
That's just how it is with this kind of investment. It's high risk, high reward.
Yeah.
And there's no way to know for sure what's going to happen.
Well said. This has been a super interesting deep dive into MicroStrategy and their bet on Bitcoin. Any last thoughts for our listeners?
I just remind everyone that this is a really complicated and constantly changing world. Do your research, stay informed, and invest wisely.
Couldn't agree more. It's been great having you on the show. Thanks for sharing your expertise with us.
Thanks for having me.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us for another episode of the Massive Wealth Podcast Disclaimer. We are not giving any investment decisions. Please do your research before investing. If this episode added value to you, then like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel.